Sterile millionaire visits the grave of the wife he kicked out of his house 20 years ago. He turns pale upon seeing a 19-year-old boy crying at her tombstone. What he discovered shocked everyone. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. It was a bitter December evening in Boston when Thaddeus Kaiton slammed his crystal tumbler onto the mahogany desk, bourbon splashing onto imported papers. His face, typically composed for boardroom battles, contorted with rage and disbelief. "Pregnant," the word escaped through clenched teeth, "and you expect me to believe this child is mine?" Elaine stood by the fireplace, hands protectively cradling her still flat stomach. Her emerald eyes, usually dancing with warmth, now shimmered with unshed tears. "Thaddeus, please, you know I've never been with anyone else. This is our miracle." His bitter laugh cut through the room's tension. "Miracle? I've been to every specialist in the country. The diagnosis was clear: I cannot father children. So tell me, Elaine, whose miracle are you carrying?" The grandfather clock ticked mercilessly as silence stretched between them. Outside, snow began to fall, coating Boston in deceptive tranquility. "I've loved you faithfully for 5 years," Elaine whispered. "I've never betrayed you." Thaddeus rose from his chair, towering over her slender frame. "My mother warned me about you, said you were after my fortune from the start." His voice dropped dangerously. "I should have listened." "Your mother never gave me a chance," Elaine replied, a rare flash of defiance crossing her features. "Just like you're not giving our child one." Thaddeus crossed to the safe hidden behind an original Monet, spinning the dial with practiced precision. He extracted a checkbook, scribbling with such force the pen nearly tore through the paper. "Here," he thrust the check toward her. "Take this and disappear. Consider it severance for services rendered." Elaine didn't even glance at the amount. "You think you can buy me off, pay me to vanish with your child?" "Not my child," he corrected coldly. "And yes, that's exactly what I expect. Be gone by morning." As Elaine turned to leave, dignity somehow intact, Thaddeus added, "If you try to contact me or make any claims about this situation, my lawyers will bury you." The bedroom door closed quietly behind her, a final act of grace she didn't owe him. Thaddeus poured another drink, telling himself the hollow feeling in his chest was righteous anger, not doubt. By dawn, Elaine had vanished from his mansion and his life, taking only a small suitcase and the torn check ripped to pieces in the wastebasket. Little did Thaddeus know that 19 years later, fate would bring him face to face with the truth he'd refused to see, beside a gravestone that would change everything. Boston's biting winter air cut through Elaine's thin coat as she wandered through unfamiliar streets, clutching her small suitcase. The majestic skyscrapers that once symbolized possibility now loomed like prison walls. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. $20. That's all she had withdrawn from the ATM before Thaddeus inevitably froze her access to their accounts. No home, no money, and a baby growing inside her. Thaddeus's baby, despite his cruel disbelief. "Think alone," she whispered to herself, breath clouding in the frigid air. "You need to get out of Boston." She thought of her college roommate, Margaret, who lived in Chicago. They'd fallen out of touch, but Margaret had always been kind-hearted. It was a long shot, but the only one she had. At South Station Bus Terminal, the ticket agent's bored expression didn't change as he quoted the price. $127.50. Elaine's stomach dropped. She'd need to beg, something she'd never imagined doing. She approached travelers with rehearsed dignity, only to be met with averted gazes and uncomfortable rejections. "Everyone thinks I'm running a scam," she thought bitterly, hunger gnawing at her stomach. "Excuse me, miss, you okay?" An elderly man with weathered hands and kind eyes stood before her. Something in his expression reminded her of her late father. I need to get to Chicago," she stammered. "I have nowhere to go here." He studied her not with suspicion but with understanding. "I was homeless once," he said simply. "Lost everything in '87. Someone helped me when nobody else would." He reached into a worn wallet and handed her exact fare. "Pay it forward someday, that's all I ask." The warmth of the bus couldn't thaw the numbness inside her, but as Boston disappeared behind her, Elaine allowed herself to breathe. She'd survived this. She had too. 18 hours later, exhausted and disoriented, she stood outside Margaret's apartment building in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. Her heart pounded as she knocked. The door swung open, revealing Margaret's familiar face, now lined with shock. "Elaine, what on earth?" "I didn't know where else to go," Elaine whispered, voice breaking. "Thaddeus threw me out." Margaret's expression softened as she noticed Alone's protective hand over her stomach. Without a word, she pulled her into a tight embrace. "Come inside," Margaret said firmly. "You're safe now." The apartment was small but warm, filled with books and colorful throws. Margaret made tea while Alone explained everything: the pregnancy, Thaddeus's accusations, her abrupt homelessness. "That bastard," Margaret muttered. "You deserve so much better." For the first time that day, Alone's shoulders relaxed. "I don't know what to do, Maggie. I have nothing." Margaret reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You have me, and you have that baby. We'll figure this out together." That night, curled under borrowed blankets on Margaret's sofa, Alone whispered to her unborn child, "We're going to be okay. I promise you that." She didn't know how yet, but somewhere between Boston and Chicago, determination had replaced despair. Thaddeus had taken everything except what mattered most: her dignity and the precious life growing inside her. Alone stared at her reflection in Margaret's bathroom mirror, her hand resting on the slight curve of her stomach that had begun to show in the past few weeks. She looked different, thinner in the face, her eyes carrying a new weariness. But there was something else, too, a quiet resolve. "You can't hide in my apartment forever," Margaret had told her gently that morning over breakfast. "Not that I mind having you here, but you need your own life alone, for yourself and for the baby." She was right. 3 weeks had passed since Alone had arrived in Chicago, and while Margaret's generosity had been a lifeline, Alone knew she couldn't build a future on borrowed space and borrowed time. The classified section of the Chicago Tribune lay open on the kitchen table, circled listings creating a road map of possibilities. Alone had been methodically calling each one, only to hear the same responses: no experience, positions filled, or the hesitant pause when she mentioned she was pregnant. "Don't give up," Margaret encouraged, squeezing her shoulder before leaving for her teaching job. "Something will work out." By afternoon, Alone had worked up the courage to walk into Sullivan's Diner, a modest establishment with a "Help Wanted" sign perpetually displayed in its window. The bell chimed as she entered, the scent of coffee and grilled onions filling her senses. "What can I get you?" asked a stern-looking woman behind the counter, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. "Actually," Alone cleared her throat, "I'm here about the job." The woman, Nancy Sullivan, as Alone would later learn, gave her a critical once-over, eyes lingering momentarily on Alone's midsection. "Ever waited tables before?" "No," Alone admitted, "but I'm a fast learner and She paused, swallowing her pride. "I really need this job." Nancy wiped her hands on her apron. "It's hard work, customers can be demanding, pay's not great." "I understand. When can you start?" The simple question nearly brought tears to Alone's eyes. "Immediately." Nancy nodded curtly. "Tomorrow, 6:00 a.m., don't be late." That evening, Alone celebrated with Margaret, the two of them sharing a cheap bottle of sparkling cider in lieu of champagne. "First step toward independence," Margaret toasted. "I'm proud of you, Elle." "I don't know how to thank you," Alone said softly, "when I showed up at your door." "That's what friends do," Margaret interrupted. "Besides, you'd have done the same for me." The next morning, Alone awoke before dawn, nervous energy propelling her through her preparations. The diner was already bustling when she arrived, truckers and early shift workers crowding the counter. Nancy thrust an apron at her. "Tables 7 through 14 are yours, coffee's always fresh, specials are on the board, and don't let anyone talk down to you." The learning curve was steep. Alone dropped a tray of dishes, mixed up orders, and endured the impatience of hungry customers. By mid-morning, her feet ached and her back screamed in protest, but she refused to show weakness. During a rare lull, Nancy appeared beside her as she refilled salt shakers. "You're doing better than I expected," she said. It wasn't exactly effusive praise, but Alone felt a small glow of accomplishment. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she replied. Nancy's eyes softened slightly. "How far along are you?" "Almost 4 months." Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "My sister's an OB nurse at County. I'll get you her information. You'll need prenatal care." The unexpected kindness brought a lump to Alone's throat. "I'd appreciate that." Days melted into weeks and a routine emerged. Alone worked morning shifts at Sullivan's, saving every dollar possible. Her small tips went into a mason jar labeled Baby Fund in Margaret's neat handwriting. At night, she scoured community newsletters for resources: second-hand baby furniture, free clinics, parenting classes. On her first day off, Alone visited the Chicago Women's Resource Center, where a counselor named Regina helped her apply for emergency medical assistance and connected her with a support group for single mothers. "You're not the first woman to start over," Regina told her, handing her a thick folder of information. "And you won't be the last, but you're doing all the right things." That evening, sitting on Margaret's fire escape and watching the sunset cast golden light across the city, Alone felt the baby move for the first time, a gentle flutter like butterfly wings. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I promise I'll give you a good life no matter what." Back in Boston, Thaddeus Cretton's business empire continued to flourish. His divorce from Alone was finalized quickly, her absence making the proceedings almost laughably simple. He told himself he felt nothing but relief as he signed the final papers, ignoring the hollow ache that had taken residence beneath his breastbone. In quiet moments, doubt sometimes crept in. What if she had been telling the truth? What if the doctors had been wrong? But he banished these thoughts quickly, focusing instead on acquisition deals and profit margins. He never looked for her, never tried to find out where she'd gone or if she'd had the baby. In his mind, that chapter was closed, the pages torn out and burned. What he didn't realize was that someday those ashes would rise again, reforming into a truth he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Alone Cretton, who had resumed using her maiden name, Bennett, was building a future brick by persistent brick. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but as she glanced at the sonogram picture taped to Margaret's refrigerator, she felt something unexpected: hope. 6 months into her new life in Chicago, Alone had settled into a rhythm that sustained her, if not fulfilled her. Her days at Sullivan's Diner had earned her a modest reputation for efficiency and quiet dignity. Regular customers now requested her section, leaving generous tips that she faithfully added to her growing savings. But as her pregnancy progressed, reality pressed in like the tightening waistband of her uniform. Her back ached constantly from hours on her feet, and Nancy had begun giving her concerned glances when she thought Alone wasn't looking. "You need a plan beyond waiting tables," Margaret said one evening as they browsed through a second-hand baby store. "Something that can support you and the baby long-term." Alone ran her fingers over a tiny blue sweater. "I know, but what? I never finished my degree, and no one's exactly lining up to hire a pregnant woman with no experience." "There are programs," Margaret insisted. "Job training, certification courses, things that could give you better options." That night, while Margaret graded papers, Alone pored over community college brochures and workforce development pamphlets. One particular program caught her eye: medical office administration. The training was only 8 months, offered evening classes, and boasted a 90% job placement rate. "This one," she told Margaret, tapping the brochure. "I could do this." The program cost was modest, but still beyond her current means. Undeterred, Alone made an appointment with a counselor at the community college. Lisa, the program advisor, listened to Alone's situation with practiced compassion. "There are scholarships for single mothers," she explained, "and payment plans. We can make this work if you're committed." "I am," Alone said firmly. "I need to build something better." 2 weeks later, Alone began attending evening classes 3 times a week after her diner shifts. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but each completed assignment felt like a victory, each passing grade a step away from the desperate woman who had arrived in Chicago with nothing but a suitcase and an unborn child. At Sullivan's, Nancy adjusted her schedule to accommodate her classes, a kindness Alone hadn't expected. "My mother raised 4 kids by herself," Nancy explained gruffly. "Anyone trying to better themselves deserves a chance." By her 8th month of pregnancy, Alone's study schedule had become a challenge. Her ankles swelled, and the hard plastic chairs in the community college classrooms felt like instruments of torture. But she persisted, completing assignments between customer orders and studying flashcards during her breaks. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," Margaret remarked one night, finding Alone asleep at the kitchen table, face pressed against an open textbook. Margaret had transformed their shared living room into a makeshift nursery, decorating it with yard sale finds and hand-me-downs from fellow teachers. A crib stood in the corner, a mobile of fabric stars hanging above it, each one sewn by Margaret during their quiet evening conversations. "It's not much," Margaret apologized, "but it's a start." "It's everything," Alone whispered, overcome with gratitude. On a crisp October morning, Alone's water broke while she was refilling the diner's sugar dispensers. Nancy drove her to the hospital herself, cursing at traffic and running 2 red lights. "Don't you dare have this baby in my Buick," she warned, but her hand gripped Alone's with reassuring strength. 16 hours later, Callum Bennett entered the world, 7 pounds of perfection with a shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they finally opened, were the unmistakable cretin blue. Holding him in her arms, Alone felt a fierce, protective love that transcended the pain of the past. "Hello, my darling," she whispered. "We made it." Margaret and Nancy took turns visiting, bringing practical gifts and taking photos that Alone cherished. There were no grandparents cooing over the new arrival, no proud father passing out cigars, but there was love, abundant and fierce. Across the country, oblivious to his son's birth, Thaddeus Cretin closed a record-breaking real estate deal and celebrated alone in his penthouse office, ignoring the persistent emptiness that success could never seem to fill. The winter after Callum's birth was the coldest Chicago had seen in decades. Alone would bundle her son in layers of second-hand clothing before venturing out to her classes, grateful that Nancy had allowed her to return to the diner on a reduced schedule. Between work, school, and motherhood, sleep became a luxury she rarely afforded herself. On particularly brutal evenings, Margaret would insist on watching Callum so Alone could attend her classes without dragging the infant through the snow. These moments of separation, though practical, tore at Alone's heart. "He won't even remember you were gone," Margaret reassured her. "And you're doing this for him." Alone knew she was right, but the guilt persisted, a familiar companion in her new life. It whispered that she wasn't enough, couldn't provide enough, should somehow be more than what she was. In quiet moments, she wondered if this was how single mothers had felt throughout history, constantly divided, perpetually inadequate. Yet there were moments of pure joy that made everything worthwhile. Callum's first smile, a gummy, lopsided grin that appeared one morning as she sang to him while changing his diaper. His fascination with the dust motes dancing in sunlight. The weight of his small body against her chest as he slept, perfect and trusting. One evening, while studying for her final exams, Alone sat with Callum in her lap, bouncing him gently while trying to memorize medical billing codes. Frustrated by her divided attention, he began to fuss, his little face screwing up in preparation for a full-throated wail. "SHH, Cal," she murmured, setting aside her flashcards. "I know, Mama's right here." She lifted him to her shoulder, patting his back rhythmically, when suddenly she felt his tiny hand pat her shoulder in return, deliberately mimicking her motion. Something about this small gesture, this first communication of "I hear you, I'm responding to you," broke through her exhaustion and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Cal," she whispered, "you and me, we're going to be just fine." That night she wrote in the worn journal she'd been keeping since his birth. "Today my son reached back for me. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. He's becoming a person, not just a baby. Someone with thoughts and feelings and ways of showing me he understands. I wonder if this is how all parents feel? This wonder, this terror, this overwhelming love. Does Thaddeus ever wonder about us? Does he ever feel the emptiness of what he's missing? I hope someday Callum won't feel that emptiness too deeply. I hope being loved by me will be enough." As winter melted into spring, Alone's determination hardened into something unbreakable. She took extra shifts when she could, studied during Callum's naps, and aced her certification exams with scores that impressed even her instructors. Her program director began sending her job postings, confident that Alone would be an asset to any medical office. Meanwhile, in Boston, Thaddeus Cretin's empire continued its relentless expansion. He had opened offices in 3 new cities, acquired a failing competitor at a fraction of its worth, and been featured in Forbes magazine as one of America's most eligible bachelors. The article mentioned his previous marriage in passing, as a brief union dissolved before children could complicate matters. Reading this in his office late one night, Thaddeus felt an unexpected pang. He hadn't allowed himself to think of Alone in months, had trained himself to skip over memories of their life together like commercials during a television program. But something about seeing their marriage reduced to a mere footnote in his success story disturbed him. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, what had become of her. Had she kept the child? Was it a boy or a girl? Had she found someone else to love, someone who could give her what she wanted? These thoughts felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice. He shut them down quickly, pouring himself another scotch and turning to the quarterly projections that demanded his attention. Real estate developments didn't build themselves on sentiment or regret. Back in Chicago, Alone received an offer from Lakeside Pediatrics, a well-established practice in Lincoln Park. The salary was modest but steady, with benefits that included health insurance for both her and Callum. The office manager had been impressed by her certifications and unfazed by her single motherhood, a combination Alone hadn't dared hope for. That evening, she and Margaret celebrated with a rare splurge, takeout from the Thai restaurant down the street and a bottle of inexpensive wine. "To new beginnings," Margaret toasted, glasses clinking in the small kitchen. "And to the friends who make them possible," Alone added, her gratitude beyond words. Later, watching Callum sleep in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath, Alone felt something she hadn't experienced since before that fateful night in Boston. Hope. Not just the desperate hope of survival, but the warm, expanding hope of possibility. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to her sleeping son, a promise she finally believed she could keep. 5 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Alone's position at Lakeside Pediatrics had evolved from front desk coordinator to office manager, her quiet competence earning the respect of doctors and patients alike. The modest raises and annual bonuses had allowed her to finally move out of Margaret's apartment and into a small two-bedroom unit in a family-friendly neighborhood. Their new home wasn't impressive by Boston standards, certainly nothing like the mansion she'd once shared with Thaddeus, but it was theirs. A place where Callum could have his own room, with walls she'd painted sky blue one weekend, where toys could scatter across the living room floor without apology, where photographs of their little family lined the hallway. On Callum's 5th birthday, Alone surprised him with a second-hand bicycle, its red paint slightly chipped but its training wheels sturdy. His face, lighting up with that particular joy that only children can express, was worth every extra shift she'd taken to afford it. "Can we go try it now, Mama? Please?" he begged, already attempting to wheel it toward the door. "Of course we can, birthday boy," she laughed, grabbing her keys. At the park, she watched him pedal unsteadily along the pathway, his dark hair, so like hers, ruffling in the breeze. But those eyes, sharp and blue as winter ice, were all Thaddeus. Sometimes it took her breath away, seeing his father looking back at her through Callum's innocent gaze. "Watch me, Mama," he called, gaining confidence with each wobbly circuit. "I see you, my love. You're doing wonderfully." Later that evening, after birthday cake with Margaret and Nancy, who had become something of a surrogate grandmother, though she'd deny it fiercely, Alone tucked an exhausted Callum into bed. "Mama," he asked sleepily, "Tommy at school says everyone has a dad. Where's mine?" The question she'd been preparing for since his birth still landed like a punch. Alone sat on the edge of his bed, choosing her words carefully. "Your father lives far away in Boston. He's a businessman who builds tall buildings." "Why doesn't he live with us?" Alone stroked his hair. "Sometimes, grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand. Before you were born, your father and I couldn't stay together, but that has nothing to do with you." "Doesn't he want to meet me?" "Oh, Cal," she sighed, heart-breaking. "Your father made choices a long time ago, but you have me and Aunt Margaret and even grumpy Miss Nancy who sneaks you cookies when she thinks I'm not looking." Callum seemed to consider this, his eyelids growing heavy. "I wish he knew me." "Someday perhaps he will," she whispered, though she had no intention of ever reaching out to Thaddeus. Some bridges once burned were better left as ashes. Across the country, Thaddeus Cretton celebrated the completion of his latest skyscraper with an exclusive rooftop party. At 52, he remained one of Boston's most eligible bachelors, though the glamour of that title had long since faded. His relationships never lasted. Women were attracted to his wealth and power, but eventually grew tired of his emotional distance, his obsession with work, his inability to truly connect. Sometimes, in rare moments of honesty, he acknowledged the emptiness of his achievements. Towers of glass and steel meant nothing when you returned to an echoing penthouse each night. But it was easier to build another building than to examine the ruins of what might have been. By the time Callum turned 10, he had grown into a thoughtful boy with a quick mind and gentle spirit. His room was filled with library books about architecture and tall buildings, an interest that sometimes made Alone's heart ache with its unknowing connection to his father. "Mom, look at this one," Callum exclaimed one evening, pointing to a photograph of a sleek skyscraper in a borrowed architecture book. "It says Cretton Enterprises built it last year. That's my last name too, right? Before you changed it back to Bennett." Alone paused, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest whenever Thaddeus edged into their conversations. "Yes, Cal, that was my married name." "So, my dad built this." His blue eyes, so achingly familiar, lit up with unexpected pride. His company did, she answered carefully. Your father is successful in business. Callum studied the building's image thoughtfully. Do you think he builds models first? I could do that. Ms. Wilson says I'm good at my science projects. Alone smiled, ruffling his hair. You're good at everything you set your mind to, Cal. That comes from both of us. These moments, the innocent questions, the natural curiosity about half his heritage, never got easier. But Alone had made a promise to herself long ago. She would never lie to Callum about Thaddeus, nor would she poison him with bitterness. The story she told was simplified but true. His father had doubted he was his, had made choices that separated them, lived a different life far away. What she kept to herself were the darker details. How Thaddeus had cruelly dismissed her, how he'd accused her of infidelity, how he'd offered money to make her disappear. Some truths were too heavy for a child's shoulders. Despite, or perhaps because of, Thaddeus's absence, Alone was determined that Callum would grow up understanding the values that truly mattered. She taught him through example, working diligently, treating others with kindness, finding joy in simple pleasures. Their Saturday routine became sacred. Volunteering at the local animal shelter in the morning, Callum's gentle way with nervous dogs was remarkable. Then to the farmer's market for fresh vegetables, an afternoon spent cooking together or visiting museums with discount passes from the library. Money remained tight, but Alone managed it carefully. Callum's school clothes came from thrift stores but were always clean and well-mended. Birthday parties were small but creative. Christmas presents might be few, but they were chosen with thoughtful care. When Callum's school assigned a family tree project, Alone helped him place Thaddeus's name on the appropriate branch, along with Unknown for Thaddeus's parents. She had never met them, had only heard cold stories from a husband who rarely spoke of his childhood. Maybe someday I'll meet him, Callum said matter-of-factly as they worked on the project. And then I can fill in more branches. Alone's hand faltered, smudging a pencil line. Maybe, she said, not wanting to crush his hope while knowing how unlikely such a meeting would be. But you know, Cal, families aren't just about branches on trees. They're about who loves you, who shows up, who makes your life better by being in it. Like Aunt Margaret and Miss Nancy. Exactly like them, she smiled, grateful for the family they had built from friendship rather than blood. That night, watching Callum sleep, Alone marveled at how completely this child had changed her. Before him, she had been a woman defined by what she'd lost. After him, she became someone defined by what she'd found. Strength she never knew she possessed, joy in the smallest moments, purpose beyond herself. Whatever Thaddeus might be building in Boston, it couldn't compare to what she was building here. A human being with both compassion and courage, a boy who might someday become the kind of man his father had never been. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the Columbia University insignia crisp against the heavy cream envelope. Alone stared at it, balanced on their kitchen counter, waiting for Callum to return from his final day of high school. 19 years had passed since she'd fled Boston with nothing. Now her son, brilliant, kind-hearted Callum, stood on the threshold of possibilities she'd once only dreamed of providing for him. When the front door finally opened, Alone's heart quickened. Callum appeared, all 6 feet of him, looking so grown-up in his faded jeans and flannel shirt that sometimes she still couldn't believe it. "It came," she said simply, nodding toward the envelope. Callum froze, his blue eyes, those inescapable cretin eyes, widening. "Is that Columbia?" She confirmed, "Your first choice." His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. "I can't open it. You do it." She shook her head. "This is your moment, Cal, whatever it says." She watched as he tore the seal, unfolded the letter, his expression shifting from tension to disbelief, to pure, unadulterated joy. "I got in," he whispered, "full scholarship." The pride that surged through Alone was overwhelming. This brilliant young man, her son, had earned his way into one of the country's most prestigious universities, not through family connections or inherited wealth, but through his own unwavering merit. "I knew you could do it," she said, voice thick with emotion as she hugged him fiercely. "I've always known." Later that evening, after the initial excitement had settled, after calls to Margaret and Nancy sharing the joyous news, after a celebratory dinner of Callum's favorite pasta, the reality began to sink in. Columbia was in New York, not Boston, but still the East Coast, still geographically closer to Thaddeus than Callum had ever been. You know, Callum said quietly as they washed dishes together, I looked it up. Cretin Enterprises has offices in New York. Alone's hand stilled in the soapy water. Cal, I'm not saying I'll contact him, he continued carefully. I thought you should know I'm aware. She nodded, resuming her task with deliberate focus. It's your life, Cal, your choice. You're old enough now to make your own decisions about that. Would it hurt you if I did try to meet him someday? The question hung between them, honest and unavoidable. Alone dried her hands slowly, turning to face her son, her heart aching with a love both fierce and fragile. Nothing could change how much I love you, she said finally. And nothing could change how incredibly proud I am of the person you've become. That said, I can't pretend it wouldn't be complicated. For me. Callum nodded, understanding passing silently between them. We don't even know if I want to, I just feel like there's this blank space. I know, she whispered, cupping his cheek, her touch gentle. I've tried to fill it as best I could. You did, he said fiercely, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. You filled it with everything important. The summer passed far too quickly, a blur of preparation and bittersweet anticipation. Alone helped Callum shop for dorm essentials, research textbooks, plan his course schedule. She kept her own fears carefully hidden, fears about money despite the generous scholarship, fears about him being so far from home, navigating a vast, unfamiliar city alone. Fears, most potent of all, about what might happen if, by chance or by choice, he crossed paths with the Cretin name and legacy. On move-in day, standing in his tiny, sterile dorm room, Alone fought valiantly to keep her composure. This separation was inevitable, healthy, exactly what she'd worked so tirelessly, so selflessly to make possible. Yet it felt as though her heart was being physically torn in two. Call me any time, she said, straightening his already neat bedspread unnecessarily. Day or night. I will, Mom, he promised, patient with her maternal fussing. Their goodbye in front of the bustling residence hall was brief, almost perfunctory. Callum was eager, understandably, to begin his new chapter, and Alone was determined not to burden him with her own complex emotions. Only later, alone on the train back to Chicago, did she finally allow herself to cry. Quiet, cathartic tears for all they had overcome together, and for the vast, uncertain future that awaited him in a city where his father's name adorned towering buildings like flags of conquest. Columbia University buzzed with the vibrant, infectious energy of autumn as Callum settled into his first demanding semester. His architectural design course quickly became his favorite, his natural, innate talent earning early praise from professors who had no inkling of the profound, almost ironic source of his intuitive understanding of structural principles. On a brisk October afternoon, Callum was walking through Lower Manhattan with his roommate, Tyler, when he stopped abruptly, his attention completely captured by a massive, gleaming skyscraper that dominated the skyline. Whoa, said Tyler, following his gaze. Impressive, right? That's the Cretin Financial Center, just finished last year. Callum stood frozen, staring at his father's name emblazoned in sleek, imposing metal letters across the building's grand entrance. Yeah, he managed, his voice barely audible. Impressive. You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that, Callum murmured, turning away, a strange mixture of awe and bitterness churning inside him. That night, alone in the relative quiet of his dorm room, Callum opened his laptop and typed Thaddeus Cretin into the search bar. He'd done this before, of course, countless times over the years, but always furtively, always with a nagging sense of betraying his mother, her sacrifices, her quiet strength. This time felt different, more urgent, more necessary. The search results cascaded across his screen. Forbes profiles, Wall Street Journal interviews, real estate development news articles. Images showed a distinguished, imposing man now in his late 60s, his hair silvered at the temples, his eyes sharp, assessing, penetrating, always impeccably dressed, often photographed alone despite attending numerous high-profile social events. An article from Boston Business Monthly caught his attention. Thaddeus Cretin, the solitary empire builder. He clicked, scanning the profile that painted his father as brilliant but isolated, respected but feared, immensely successful but seemingly profoundly unfulfilled. Despite 2 failed marriages, the article noted coolly, Cretin remains childless with no apparent heir to his considerable fortune. Childless, the word struck Callum like a physical blow. He existed. He was real. Yet in the official, widely accepted narrative of Thaddeus Cretin's life, he simply didn't. Further research revealed Cretin Enterprises maintained significant offices just 15 blocks from his dormitory. The proximity felt both terrifying and strangely magnetic, as if some invisible, inexorable force was pulling them, father and son, into the same orbit after 19 years of deliberate, calculated separation. The next morning, Callum found himself walking past the Cretin building again, studying the people entering and exiting, wondering if any of them knew his father personally, wondering if they would see the undeniable resemblance if they looked at him closely enough. He continued this almost obsessive routine for days, drawn back repeatedly, gathering courage, steeling his resolve. He told no one, not Tyler, not his new college friends, and certainly not his mother during their regular, carefully casual phone calls. "How are classes?" Alone would ask, her voice warm, familiar, reassuring across the miles. And he'd describe his projects in meticulous detail, omitting the fact that he was designing them with techniques, with an aesthetic sensibility he'd gleaned from studying photographs of his father's iconic buildings. "Are you eating properly?" she'd worry, the familiar maternal concern evident in her tone. And he'd assure her about the adequate, if uninspired, dining hall meals, not mentioning that he'd lost his appetite almost completely since discovering the looming, unavoidable presence of the Cretin building in his new city. Finally, on a rain-soaked Friday afternoon, Callum made a decision. Dressed in his best clothes, dark jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and the well-fitting blazer his mother had saved for months to buy him as a high school graduation gift, he entered the imposing lobby of Cretin Enterprises. The interior was exactly as he'd imagined. Soaring ceilings, gleaming marble floors, tasteful, understated artwork that probably cost more than his mother's entire annual salary. At the massive reception desk, a polished, impeccably groomed woman in her 40s looked up expectantly. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice coolly professional. Callum's heart thundered in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears, loud, insistent. He thought of his mother, of her countless sacrifices, of her quiet, unwavering strength. He thought of the blank spaces in his family tree, the unanswered questions that had haunted him since childhood. He thought of the man whose name adorned this building, whose blood ran in his veins, whose cold rejection had shaped his life from before he was even born. "Yes," he said, finding his voice at last, surprised by its steadiness. "I need to see Thaddeus Cretin." Her perfectly shaped eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Callum admitted, "but he'll want to see me." "And you are?" Callum straightened, the weight of 19 years settling onto his young shoulders as he spoke the words he'd never said aloud before, the words that felt both terrifying and liberating. "I'm his son." The receptionist's professional mask slipped momentarily, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly before she quickly regained her composure. "I'll see if Mr. Cretin is available. Your name, please." Callum Bennett." She disappeared through sleek, frosted glass doors, leaving Callum alone in the vast, hushed lobby, his thundering heartbeat echoing in the cavernous space. The lobby's hushed, almost reverent atmosphere felt suffocating. Business people dressed in expensive suits passed through, their curious, appraising glances making him acutely, painfully aware of his youth, his outsider status. Minutes stretched agonizingly, feeling like hours before the glass doors reopened. A security officer emerged, tall, stern-faced, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, an earpiece discreetly nestled in his ear. "Mr. Cretin will see you," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Follow me." Callum's legs felt heavy, almost wooden, as he followed the impassive man through a maze of pristine corridors, past curious, whispering employees. They reached an executive elevator requiring a key card, ascending silently, smoothly to the top floor. The executive suite occupied the entire level, minimalist, powerful, imposing, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. At the far end of the expansive space, behind a massive desk of dark, polished wood, sat Thaddeus Cretin. Seeing him in person, not in faded photographs or fragmented imagination, knocked the air completely from Callum's lungs. The resemblance was undeniable, almost startling. The same strong jawline, the same piercing, intelligent blue eyes, even the way his hands rested on the desk, fingers splayed slightly, commanding space, asserting dominance. Time seemed suspended as father and son regarded each other across the vast expanse of gleaming hardwood and 19 years of unspoken history. "Leave us," Thaddeus instructed the security officer, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. The officer nodded and retreated silently, the heavy door closing with a soft, final click behind him. When they were alone, Thaddeus spoke first, his voice controlled, carefully modulated, but with an underlying tension that betrayed his outward composure. "My receptionist says you claim to be my son." Callum swallowed, finding his voice forcing it past the lump in his throat. "I am your son." "I don't have a son." "Because you chose not to," Callum replied, his voice stronger now, fueled by a sudden surge of righteous anger. "My mother is Alone Bennett. You knew her as Alone Cretin, before you threw her out 19 years ago for being pregnant with me." Thaddeus's expression remained impassive, unreadable, but something flickered in the depths of his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "What do you want? Money?" The crass question stung more than Callum had anticipated. "I don't want your money. I'm here on full scholarship at Columbia." "Then what? Some kind of recognition? A family connection?" Callum moved closer to the desk, studying the man who had contributed half his DNA, yet remained a complete, utter stranger. "I wanted to see you, to understand how someone could abandon their own child without a second thought." Thaddeus rose slowly, walking stiffly to the vast window overlooking the city he had helped build. For a moment he seemed to age before Callum's eyes, his broad shoulders carrying an invisible, crushing weight. "You think I never thought about it?" he asked quietly, his voice rough, almost gravelly. "Never wondered." "If you wondered, you could have found us. Mom never hid." Thaddeus turned, his gaze clinical, detached, as he assessed Callum feature by feature. "You have her coloring," her chin. A pause. "My eyes." Another pause. "And your talent for architecture, apparently," Callum said stiffly. "I'm studying structural design at Columbia." Something unreadable crossed Thaddeus's face, a fleeting emotion Callum couldn't decipher. "That's interesting. Was it worth it?" Callum asked suddenly, the question raw, unplanned. "Building all this, while missing everything about me? My first steps, my graduations, my entire life." Thaddeus returned to his desk, resuming control, retreating behind his familiar, impenetrable facade. "I made a decision based on the information I had at the time. I believed your mother had been unfaithful." "And you never questioned that belief, never once thought you might be wrong." "By the time I had doubts, years had passed. What was I supposed to do? Disrupt the life you and your mother had built?" Callum laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Is that how you justify it, that you were doing us a favor by staying away?" Thaddeus's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly. "You don't understand the complexities." "No, I understand perfectly," Callum interrupted, his voice sharp with 19 years of pent-up anger and confusion. "You chose your empire over your family, your pride over the truth." He turned to leave, suddenly, overwhelmingly exhausted by the encounter that had consumed his imagination for so many years. "Callum," Thaddeus called, stopping him at the door. "Does Alone know you're here?" Callum met his father's gaze one last time, his own eyes mirroring the same piercing blue. "No, and she spent 19 years making sure I never needed you. I just needed to see for myself what kind of man walks away from his child." He left without looking back, the immense weight of unresolved history heavy on his young shoulders as the elevator descended, carrying him away from the father who had never truly been his, back to a world forever, irrevocably changed by their brief, tumultuous meeting. Callum walked for hours through Manhattan's rigid grid, oblivious to the biting autumn chill, his mind replaying every second, every word, every nuance of the encounter with Thaddeus. The man had been exactly as he'd imagined, cold, calculating, defensive, yet somehow entirely different too. There had been moments, fleeting but undeniable, when something almost like regret, almost like sorrow, had flickered across his father's carefully composed face, only to be quickly masked behind a lifetime's practice of stoic indifference. By nightfall, Callum found himself back in Central Park, sitting on a bench overlooking the dark, glassy surface of the reservoir. His phone had been vibrating periodically in his pocket, insistent but ignored, probably Tyler, wondering where he'd disappeared to, perhaps his mother, checking in with her usual warmth and concern. The thought of Alone sent a fresh wave of guilt washing through him. She deserved to know what he'd done, where he'd been, but he couldn't bear the thought of telling her over the phone, of hearing the potential hurt, the disappointment in her voice. When he finally checked his messages, his suspicions were confirmed. 3 texts from Tyler about their upcoming study group and 2 missed calls from his mother. With cold, numb fingers, he dialed her number. Callum, her voice came through, warm with immediate relief. I was getting worried. Sorry, Mom, I was out and lost track of time. You sound strange. Is everything okay? He'd never been able to hide anything from her. Even across hundreds of miles, she could read his moods like intricate weather patterns. He began, then faltered, the words catching in his throat. I did something I should tell you about. The silence on the other end of the line was expectant, patient. Alone had always given him the space he needed to find his words, to articulate his thoughts, his feelings. I went to see him, Callum finally said, the words rushing out in a torrent of relief and apprehension. Thaddeus, my father. The sharp intake of breath on the other end was the only audible indication of her shock. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully, deliberately measured. I see, and how did that go? About as well as you'd expect, he said, attempting a humor that fell miserably flat. He didn't deny I was his son, at least not after he got a good look at me, but he didn't exactly welcome me with open arms either. Oh, Cal, she sighed, and he could vividly picture her closing her eyes, gathering her thoughts, her strength. I always knew this day might come. I just hoped that I wouldn't go looking for answers that would hurt me. He finished for her, his voice tinged with a familiar, weary understanding. Something like that, she admitted softly. Was it? Did you get what you needed from the meeting? Callum watched the distant city lights shimmer, distorted on the water's dark surface, considering her question. Not really, I thought I'd feel something. Closure maybe, or anger, connection, even something, but mostly, I just felt empty. Like I'd built this moment up in my mind for years, imagined it 1,000 different ways, and the reality was so much smaller, so much less significant than my imagination. That's often true about the monsters under our beds, she said softly, her voice filled with a gentle maternal wisdom. He's so cold, Mom, so contained. Is that what he was like when you knew him? A long pause followed, filled only by the faint crackle of the phone line. Not always, she finally said, her voice distant, almost nostalgic. When we first met, he could be passionate, focused, even kind in his own guarded way, but success changed him, or maybe it just magnified what was already there, his ambition, his self-protection, his deep-seated inability to truly trust anyone. He said he had doubts about whether I was his, but he never looked for us. No, she confirmed, her voice quiet, resigned. He never did. Callum felt a familiar lump forming in his throat, a constriction of grief and confusion. How could he not want to know? How could he build all these massive structures that will last for generations, but not care about his own flesh and blood? Some people aren't capable of giving the kind of love a child deserves, Alone said gently. It's not about you, Cal. It never was. It was always about his limitations, his fears, not yours. I told him I didn't want his money, Callum continued, the memory still stinging. But I think that's all he thought I could possibly want from him, like there couldn't be any other conceivable reason to seek him out. That's how he understands the world, she explained, her voice tinged with a sadness that mirrored his own. Through transactions and assets, profits and losses, it's sad, really. Callum nodded, though she couldn't see him. I kept waiting to feel something, some cosmic connection, some undeniable recognition in my blood, but there was nothing, just a stranger with my eyes. Are you disappointed? She asked, her voice thick with concern, with a mother's unwavering love. No, he realized, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. No, I think I'm relieved. I've spent so long wondering about this missing piece, this shadow hanging over my life. But now I've seen him, talked to him, and he's just a man, a successful, incredibly lonely man who made choices he can't unmake. The immense weight that had been pressing on Callum's chest since entering the imposing Cretan building began to lift, replaced by a strange, unexpected sense of peace. He took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp night air. You were enough, Mom, he said suddenly, fiercely, the words pouring out from a place of newfound clarity, of profound gratitude. You've always been enough, more than enough. I need you to know that. On the other end of the line, he heard a soft sniffle, quickly suppressed. That means everything to me, Cal, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They talked a while longer about his classes, about her work, about the small, ordinary, comforting things that tethered them together across the distance. When they finally said good night, Callum felt a sense of peace, of resolution he hadn't expected to find on this tumultuous, emotionally charged day. Walking back to campus through the quiet, sleeping city, he realized something profound had shifted inside him. For 19 years, he'd been defined, at least partly, by an absence. The missing father, the unanswered questions, the blank spaces in his personal history. But that emptiness no longer felt like a void that needed filling. It was just a fact, an unalterable part of his story, like the color of his hair or the shape of his hands. Thaddeus Cretton had given him life and then walked away. But alone Bennett had given him everything else. Love, values, strength. And the quiet, unwavering wisdom to recognize what truly mattered. Thanksgiving arrived with unseasonable warmth in Chicago. Alone had spent the morning preparing a modest feast: turkey, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and the pumpkin pie that had become their cherished tradition. The small apartment was filled with comforting, nostalgic aromas when Callum's key finally turned in the lock. "Mom," he called, dropping his heavy duffel bag unceremoniously in the entryway. Alone wiped her hands on her apron and rushed to embrace him, holding him tight. 3 months of college had changed him subtly, undeniably. A new confidence in his posture, a sharper definition to his features, the unmistakable beginnings of adulthood settling firmly onto his young shoulders. "Look at you," she said, stepping back to take him in, her eyes shining with pride and love. "College agrees with you." "It's good to be home," he smiled, following her into the cozy kitchen, where he immediately began helping, falling easily, gratefully back into their old, familiar rhythms. They worked side by side, catching up on the small, everyday things. His challenging architectural projects, her recent promotion at the medical office, Margaret's amusingly disastrous new boyfriend, Nancy's surprisingly successful hip replacement. Neither mentioned Thaddeus directly, though his unspoken presence, his invisible shadow, lingered between them. Later, after the dinner dishes were cleared away, they settled comfortably on the worn sofa with steaming mugs of warm cider. The comfortable silence between them, the easy companionship, had always been one of Alone's favorite things about their relationship. How they could simply exist together peacefully, without the constant pressure of filling empty space with meaningless chatter. "I've been thinking a lot," Callum said, finally breaking the quiet intimacy, "about our phone call after I saw him." Alone nodded, giving him the space he needed to continue, her heart bracing itself. "I keep wondering if I was wrong to go there, if I betrayed you somehow." She set her mug down carefully, turning to face him fully, her expression open, honest. "Cal, you didn't betray me. You were seeking answers about your own life, your own history. That's natural. It's understandable. But after everything you did for us, everything you sacrificed—" "Listen to me," she interrupted gently, her voice firm but kind. "I never wanted you to spend your life wondering. I never wanted Thaddeus to have that kind of power over you, the power of the unknown." Callum studied his hands, so like hers in shape, yet larger now, stronger. "When I was sitting in his office, looking at everything he'd built, all those buildings, all that wealth, I kept thinking about what you built instead. It wasn't skyscrapers or companies, but it was so much more important." "Oh, Cal," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He asked if you knew I was there," Callum continued. I think he was worried you'd sent me too, I don't know, to confront him on your behalf or something." Alone smiled sadly, a familiar weariness in her eyes. That would be his perspective, wouldn't it? Seeing everything as a potential attack, a transaction, a power play. "Were you ever tempted to go back, to show him he was wrong?" She considered this, tracing the rim of her mug thoughtfully with her fingertip. "In the early days, yes, I fantasized about returning successful, wealthy, rubbing his nose in it, proving him wrong. But as time passed, I realized something important. Proving him wrong meant he was still defining my choices, my life. True freedom came when I stopped measuring my life against his expectations, his failures." "That's what I felt," Callum nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes, walking out of his office. Like I was finally free of this ghost I'd been carrying around my whole life. They sat in comfortable silence again for a long moment before Callum spoke once more. "I think I understand now why you never told me the worst parts, about how he treated you when you told him about me." Alone raised an eyebrow, surprised. "How did you know there were worse parts?" "Because I met him," Callum said simply, "and because, no matter how bad the story got when you told it, you never seemed angry enough for someone who'd just been abandoned like that. You were protecting me from the full truth." Alone reached for his hand, her touch warm, grounding. "You deserve to form your own opinions, Cal, without my pain coloring your perspective. And you deserve to know your father through your own eyes, not mine." That's what makes you different from him, Callum said, with a sudden, profound clarity that resonated deep within both of them. He made every choice thinking only of himself. You made every choice thinking of me. As they embraced, a long, tight hug filled with 19 years of unspoken emotions, Alone felt decades of tension, of fear, of uncertainty begin to dissolve. Her son had faced his ghost, his past, and emerged stronger, wiser, whole. Whatever happened next, they would face it together just as they always had. February painted New York in stark, unforgiving shades of gray. Callum hurried across the windswept campus, his collar turned up against the biting wind, his mind occupied with demanding midterm projects and looming deadlines. His phone vibrated insistently in his pocket, likely Tyler asking about their planned study session, but the number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar. New York area code. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "Callum Bennett," a woman's voice inquired, professionally detached, coolly efficient. "Yes, that's me. I'm calling from the office of Thaddeus Cretin. He'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." Callum stopped walking abruptly, students streaming around him like water flowing around a stone. "Why?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details. Would tomorrow at 3:00 p.m. be possible?" His immediate instinct was to refuse, to protect the fragile peace, the hard-won closure he'd found since their last tumultuous encounter. But curiosity, a persistent, undeniable curiosity, prevailed. "Fine, tomorrow at 3:00. The Cretin building seemed different this time, less intimidating, merely glass and steel, impressive structures constructed by human hands. As before, security escorted him silently to the top floor, but something felt off. The employees they passed seemed subdued, almost somber, exchanging hushed glances as he walked by. Thaddeus wasn't behind his imposing, barrier-like desk. Instead, Callum found him standing by the vast window, gazing out at the sprawling skyline, looking somehow diminished. "Thank you for coming," Thaddeus said without turning, his voice rougher, more gravelly than Callum remembered. "Your assistant was persuasive," Callum replied cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Thaddeus turned then, and Callum struggled to mask his shock. In just 4 short months, his father seemed to have aged years. The distinguished silver hair had thinned considerably. The sharp, commanding features were now hollowed, almost gaunt. The formidable, imposing presence replaced by something fragile, something undeniably vulnerable. "Please, sit." Thaddeus gestured toward a comfortable seating area, rather than the formal, confrontational desk arrangement of their previous meeting. Once settled, Thaddeus got straight to the point, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I have pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the prognosis is limited." The words hung in the air between them, heavy, stark, imbued with an inescapable finality. Callum felt an unexpected, complex surge of emotion, not quite sadness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a strange, unsettling mixture of pity and a reluctant, almost grudging empathy. "I'm sorry," he said finally, meaning it with a sincerity that surprised him. "I've been thinking," Thaddeus continued, his gaze distant, unfocused, "about our conversation, about choices and consequences. When death becomes more than merely theoretical priorities have a way of clarifying themselves." Callum remained silent, watching this powerful man, his father by blood but stranger by choice, struggle with words, with emotions that clearly didn't come easily to him. "I was wrong," Thaddeus said simply, the admission stark, unadorned. "About your mother, about you. I've been wrong for 19 years. "Why tell me this now?" Callum asked, wary of potential deathbed manipulations, of 11th-hour attempts at reconciliation. "Because I don't have the luxury of time anymore," Thaddeus replied, his hands, once steady enough to sign billion-dollar contracts without a tremor, now trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly. "And because I'd like the chance to know my son before I go." "What exactly are you asking for?" Thaddeus met his gaze directly then, his blue eyes, though clouded with illness, still holding a spark of their former intensity. "Conversation, nothing more. I don't expect forgiveness or affection, just the opportunity to know something about you beyond the mere fact of your existence." Callum studied the man before him, powerful yet powerless, accomplished yet failing at what mattered most. He thought of his mother, of her quiet strength, her unwavering grace, her refusal to harbor bitterness, who had taught him, by example, that compassion wasn't weakness. "I have class on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said finally, the decision forming, solidifying within him. "I could come on Monday afternoons." A wave of palpable relief washed over Thaddeus's haggard features. That would be acceptable, thank you, Callum. As Callum stood to leave, Thaddeus asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper, "Will you tell Alone?" The question carried layers of unspoken meaning. Would Alone try to stop these meetings? Would she feel betrayed? Had Thaddeus, even now, earned the simple acknowledgement of his impending death? Yes, Callum said firmly, his voice unwavering. We don't keep secrets from each other. Descending in the silent, sterile elevator, Callum felt strangely hollow. He had imagined countless scenarios involving Thaddeus over the years. Angry confrontations, tearful reconciliations, dramatic explanations. But never this. Never this quiet, almost reluctant compassion for the dying man who had rejected him before he was even born. Outside, standing on the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, he called his mother. When she answered, her voice warm, familiar, instantly soothing, he realized with a start that he was crying. "Cal, what's wrong?" "He's dying, Mom," Callum said, his voice breaking. "Thaddeus is dying, and he wants to know me before he goes." The silence that followed on the other end of the line contained 19 years of complicated history, of unspoken pain, of resilient love. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally, her voice gentle, supportive, putting his needs, his feelings first as she always had. I think I need to give him this chance," Callum admitted, the words feeling both right and incredibly difficult. "Not for him, for me." "Then that's what you should do," she said softly, her love, her unwavering support, a tangible presence across the miles. "And Cal, I'll be here whatever happens." Monday afternoons became sacred, a quiet ritual carved out amidst the demanding chaos of Callum's first year at Columbia. He would arrive at Cretin Tower at precisely 3:00 p.m., riding the hushed executive elevator to the top floor where Thaddeus waited. As the weeks passed, their meetings gradually migrated from the formal, imposing office to Thaddeus's stunning penthouse apartment. A breathtaking space of glass, steel, and minimalist leather furniture that somehow, despite its opulence, felt unlived in, impersonal like a meticulously staged magazine spread rather than a true home. The conversations began awkwardly, stilted. Thaddeus asked about Columbia, about Callum's challenging architectural studies, about his life, his friends in Chicago. Callum answered with careful, polite restraint, revealing facts without betraying emotion, maintaining a subtle but distinct wall of polite distance between them. But as Thaddeus weakened visibly with each passing week, something shifted, subtly but profoundly. Their discussions deepened, ventured into more personal territory. "Tell me about your childhood," Thaddeus requested one overcast afternoon, thin oxygen tubes now a permanent, jarring fixture beneath his nose. Callum hesitated, then found himself sharing stories he hadn't planned to reveal. His mother working double shifts at the diner to afford his first bicycle, ambitious science fair projects constructed entirely from recycled materials. Christmases that were undeniably modest, but always filled with laughter, warmth, and abundant love. "She never spoke badly of you," Callum admitted, the words surprising even himself. "She could have poisoned me against you, but she didn't." Thaddeus's eyes closed briefly, a spasm of pain crossing his features that clearly had nothing to do with his physical disease. "She was always better than I deserved." During their fifth meeting, Thaddeus asked a nurse to retrieve a worn, leather-bound journal from his bedroom. "I never spoke much about my own childhood," he said, his voice weak but clear as he handed the journal to Callum. Perhaps that was part of the problem. The journal contained Thaddeus's earliest, often painful memories. Growing up with a demanding, emotionally withholding father who measured love solely in achievements. A manipulative mother who used affection as currency, as a tool for control. A household where vulnerability was perceived as weakness and failure was simply unforgivable. "I'm not offering excuses," Thaddeus clarified, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the penthouse window, "merely context. I became what I was raised to be, ruthlessly successful, emotionally bankrupt." Callum studied his father, seeing not the imposing titan of industry, but a man profoundly shaped, perhaps even broken by generational damage, by emotional patterns he hadn't been strong enough or perhaps aware enough to break. "When your mother told me she was pregnant," Thaddeus continued, his voice barely a whisper now, "I panicked. Doctors had confirmed I couldn't father children, a lingering consequence of a sports injury in college. I assumed betrayal, because that's what my experience, my upbringing had taught me to expect. Trust was a luxury I'd never learned how to afford." You could have had tests done, Callum said, not accusingly, but as a simple statement of fact. Yes, Thaddeus acknowledged, a flicker of deep, abiding regret in his eyes. But that would have required admitting uncertainty, admitting I might be wrong. I was never good at that. As March turned into a blustery, unpredictable April, Thaddeus declined rapidly. Their meetings moved from the penthouse to a sterile, impersonal hospital room where machines beeped constant, unwelcome reminders of mortality, and nurses spoke in hushed, somber tones. During what would be their final conversation, Thaddeus seemed unusually alert, almost peaceful, a strange serenity settling over his frail form. "I've updated my will," he said without preamble, his voice surprisingly steady. "Everything goes to you." Callum shook his head immediately. "I don't want your money." "I know," Thaddeus replied with an unexpected, almost startling gentleness. "That's precisely why it should be yours, not as payment or compensation, but as acknowledgement. You are my son, my only child, the best thing I never deserved." He reached for Callum's hand, his grip surprisingly strong, almost desperate. "I've made arrangements for something else, too. A private investigator located your mother's parents. In England, they never knew about you. I've established contact. The details are in my papers." Callum stared at him, stunned into silence. "My grandparents are alive." "Very much so, and eager to know their grandson." Thaddeus's eyes held a fleeting hint of their former sharpness, their commanding intensity. "Don't waste decades as I did, Callum. Time. Time is the one commodity no amount of wealth can ever purchase." That evening, as Callum prepared to leave, Thaddeus spoke once more, his voice fatting, growing weaker. "I never said these words to anyone, and meant them," he murmured, his consciousness beginning to drift. "But I am sorry, Callum, truly sorry." Callum squeezed his father's hand gently, a gesture of forgiveness, of acceptance of a complex, bittersweet peace. "I know," he whispered. "Rest now." 3 days later, Thaddeus Cretton died peacefully in his sleep. The man who had spent a lifetime building towering monuments to his own formidable legacy found his most meaningful, most enduring connection in his final days, with the son he had once cruelly rejected, but ultimately, profoundly, recognized as his greatest potential legacy, the only one that truly mattered. The cemetery overlooked Boston Harbor, ancient, weathered trees standing like silent sentinels over generations of the city's elite. Alone stood beside Callum as Thaddeus's casket was lowered slowly into the cold, unforgiving ground, her face composed, serene, her hand steady, reassuring in her son's grasp. She had flown in for the funeral at Callum's request, not for Thaddeus, the man who had broken her heart, but for the remarkable young man who needed to properly, definitively close this complicated chapter of his life. The service had been well attended by business associates and various acquaintances, but noticeably, poignantly absent of genuine tears, of heartfelt grief. A life built primarily on transactions, on acquisitions and mergers, had yielded relationships of precisely the same cold, impersonal nature. As the last mourners dispersed, their expensive cars gliding silently away, Callum and alone remained, watching the groundskeepers begin their somber work. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mother's unwavering concern. "I think so," he nodded, his gaze distant. "It's strange, I barely knew him, yet I feel this loss." "You're mourning what could have been, Callum, as much as what was," she said gently. "That's natural, that's human." They walked slowly, arm in arm, through the quiet, peaceful cemetery past elaborate family mausoleums and weathered marble angels, until they reached another grave, simpler, less ostentatious, with fresh flowers already placed carefully upon it. "Alone Marie Bennett, beloved daughter, 1976-2017. Callum knelt beside the modest headstone, placing the white roses they had brought. "I still can't believe she died before I could meet her," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Alone squeezed his shoulder. "Your grandmother would have adored you, Cal. She was kind and stubborn and fiercely independent, just like you." After Thaddeus's startling revelation about her parents, Alone had reconnected with her estranged family in England, beginning the slow, often painful process of healing wounds decades old. Learning her mother had passed just 2 years earlier had been deeply painful, a sharp, unexpected grief. But discovering her father was alive, frail but well, and longing desperately to meet his only grandson had brought an unexpected, almost overwhelming joy. "Grandfather arrives tomorrow," Callum said, rising to his feet. "He's eager to show us the family home in the countryside. It feels like everything's coming full circle." Alone observed, a sense of wonder in her voice, connecting past to present in ways I never imagined possible. They left the cemetery in companionable silence, driving to the formal reading of Thaddeus's will. The lawyer's office was predictably austere, the proceedings formal, almost sterile. As promised, Thaddeus had left everything to Callum: the vast business empire, numerous properties scattered across the globe, extensive worldwide investments, priceless art collections, a staggering fortune built meticulously over decades of relentless ambition. "What will you do with it all?" Elone asked later, as they walked along the bustling Boston Harbor waterfront, the city skyline glittering majestically across the deep blue water. Callum considered, watching the sailboats sway gently at their moorings in the late afternoon sun. "I've been thinking about establishing a foundation for single parents pursuing education, providing scholarships, child care, housing stipends, the kinds of things that would have helped you all those years ago." Alone's eyes shimmered with tears, her heart swelling with pride. "That's beautiful, Cal. And I want to create an architectural scholarship at Columbia, one based purely on merit, on talent, rather than on connections or privilege." He paused, then added, a tentative smile touching his lips, "I thought we could name it after both of you, the Cretton Bennett Fellowship." Symbolism wasn't lost on Alone. The joining of names that had once been violently torn apart, creating something positive, something meaningful, something lasting from a painful, fractured history. As the sunset painted the harbor in breathtaking hues of amber and gold, Callum reached for his mother's hand, his grip strong, steady. "I spent so long wondering about him," he confessed, his voice quiet but firm. "Resenting his absence, his choices, but if he'd stayed, if he'd been different. My whole life would have unfolded differently, too." "For better or worse," Elone agreed softly. I think I'm finally at peace with it," Callum said, a sense of profound resolution settling over him. "With all of it, his rejection led to your strength. Your struggle gave me values money could never buy. Even his late acknowledgement has created opportunities to help others." Alone wrapped her arm around her son's waist, leaning into his solid, comforting presence. "From the moment I knew you existed," she said simply, her voice filled with a love that transcended time, circumstance, and sorrow, "you gave my life purpose. Everything else, the hardships, the victories, even this unexpected, overwhelming inheritance, it's all just been part of our journey. Together." As darkness fell gently over the historic city of Boston, mother and son turned toward the future, carrying with them the invaluable lessons of the past, but no longer burdened, no longer defined by its long, persistent shadows.